Jeremiah had lived enough lonely years on his Montana ranch to think he knew the sound of the wind. He was wrong. The wind didn't just whisper through the tall grass, it carried secrets, and sometimes it carried warnings. He'd given up on love, on people, on anything that couldn't be fixed with his own two calloused hands. His heart was a locked room, the key long since thrown away. But one cold morning, a letter came. A letter that would prove the wind had one more secret to tell, and it was a secret that would burn his quiet world to the ground. The paper was thin, the edges worn soft from a long journey. Mail was a rare thing, a ghost from a world he'd left behind. He didn't have neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from, let alone write letters. He sliced it open with his pocket knife, his sun-cracked face unreadable. The handwriting inside was neat, but there was a tremor in the ink, a tiny vibration of fear. It was from a woman named Julia, a name as simple as a wildflower. She wrote from the east, a place of crowds and smoke, and she was looking for a new life, a new start, a husband. He read the words over and over. She sounded brave, she sounded kind. But underneath the polite phrases about wanting a home and a partner, Jeremiah felt something else. A current of desperation, a plea buried between the lines. He'd spent his life reading the land, noticing the subtle shift of a deer's ear in the brush, the way the clouds gathered before a storm. He could read people too, even their ghosts on a page. And Julia's ghost was running from something. Still, a spark he thought had died long ago flickered inside his chest. Hope. It was a dangerous thing on the frontier. He wrote back. One simple word. Come. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension. He fixed the roof of the small cabin, patched a fence he'd been meaning to get to for months, and found himself staring down the dusty road more often than he'd admit. He was a man carved from the land itself, his face a map of sun and wind, his eyes holding the memory of a love that had turned to dust in his hands. He'd told himself his work was enough. The cattle, the horses, the endless sky. But the silence in his cabin had grown louder over the years. Julia's journey west was a blur of rattling coach wheels and the faces of strangers. Each mile that passed was a mile further from the life she was desperate to forget. She clutched a small, worn satchel in her lap, her knuckles white. Inside was everything she had left. Hope was a fragile cargo, and the road was rough. When the stagecoach finally pulled to a stop under a rising Montana sun, she felt a lurch in her stomach that was equal parts terror and relief. Jeremiah was there, waiting. He looked exactly as she'd imagined, and yet, not at all. He was stronger, quieter, his presence as solid as the mountains in the distance. He watched her step down from the coach, his eyes missing nothing. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and for a long moment they just stood there. Two strangers, bound by a few lines of ink, each carrying a past heavier than their luggage. He reached out a hand, steady and sure. "Welcome to Montana," he said, his voice a low rumble. She took his hand, her own trembling slightly. "I'm ready to start," she lied. Because she wasn't just starting something new. She was ending something old. And she had a terrible feeling it had followed her all the way here. Julia woke the next morning to a silence so deep it felt like a weight on her chest. The dawn light was pale, filtering through the single small window of the cabin. Back east, the city was a constant roar. Here, the only sounds were the lowing of distant cattle and the sigh of the wind. The cabin was sparse, built for survival, not comfort. A rough wooden table, a narrow bed, a cold stove. It was a blank slate, or a cage. She wasn't sure which yet. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside. The sheer scale of the land stole her breath. It rolled on forever, a sea of grass under an endless sky. It was beautiful, terrifying, and achingly lonely. Jeremiah was already by the corral, moving with an easy, practiced grace as he tended to the horses. He looked up as she approached, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He gave a curt nod. "Morning." "Morning," she replied, her voice smaller than she'd intended. This was real. This man, this place, this was her life now. He watched her with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. He was trying to figure her out, she knew. Trying to see if the woman from the letter matched the woman standing before him. She hoped he couldn't see the secrets she was hiding behind her eyes. The first days were a special kind of hell. Julia was a city woman. Her hands were soft, her muscles unaccustomed to the relentless labor of the ranch. Mending fences, hauling water, chopping wood, every part of her ached. Jeremiah wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't a patient teacher either. He expected her to learn, to keep up, to pull her weight. His instructions were short, his corrections blunt. When she fumbled a knot or spooked a horse, a flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, would cross his face, and it felt sharper than any physical blow. She felt clumsy, useless, a fragile doll dropped into a world of stone and iron. She was starting to think she'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe you couldn't outrun your past after all. One afternoon, her hands raw and bleeding from a splintered fence post, she finally broke. She sat on the porch steps, tears of frustration silently tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She didn't hear Jeremiah approach until he sat down beside her, the wood groaning under his weight. He held out a tin cup of water. She took it, refusing to look at him. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It just takes time." She finally looked up, shocked by the unexpected kindness. "I want to be good at this," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I want to earn my place." A small, sad smile touched his lips. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it changed his whole face, softening the hard lines around his eyes. "You already have," he said quietly. But as he said it, his eyes drifted toward the road, a flicker of a shadow passing through them. It was the same look he'd had when she arrived, a look that said he was watching for something, or someone. And in that moment, Julia knew, he had secrets too. As the weeks bled into one another, a fragile rhythm began to form between them. Julia's hands toughened, her body grew stronger, and she learned the language of the ranch, the low rumble of a hungry cow, the sharp crack of a dry branch underfoot. Jeremiah, in turn, began to open up. Not with words, not at first, but with small gestures. He started leaving a cup of hot coffee for her on the stove in the mornings. He taught her how to ride, his hand steady on her back until she found her balance. Sometimes, in the evenings by the fire, he'd tell her stories of the land, of the animals, of the unforgiving winters and the brief, beautiful summers. She learned to listen to his silences, to understand the different shades of his quiet, but their two worlds still grated against each other. She missed the simple things, the smell of a bakery, the sound of other people's voices, the feeling of not being utterly, completely alone in a vast wilderness. He, she could tell, sometimes chafed at her presence, at the way she filled the silence he had curated for so long. Their peace was a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Then the storm came. It rolled in without warning, a monstrous, bruised cloud that swallowed the sun and turned the sky black. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and rain hammered the small cabin, each drop like a thrown stone. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the world. Jeremiah was out with the herd, trying to drive them into the relative safety of a small canyon. Julia paced the cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but the thought of him out there, alone in that chaos, was worse. She grabbed a heavy oilskin cloak, took a deep breath, and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly ripped the door from her hand. Rain blinded her, plastering her hair to her face. She fought her way toward the barn, calling his name, her voice swallowed by the roar of the storm. She found him by the corral, wrestling with a heavy gate that had been torn from its hinges and was now swinging wildly in the gale. If it broke free, the horses would bolt in terror. Without a word, they threw their combined weight against it. The wind fought back, a physical, malevolent force. Sleet stung their faces, and their hands, numb with cold, slipped on the wet wood. In that moment, there was no past, no future, no east or west. There was only the two of them, a single point of resistance against the fury of nature. Together they managed to heave the gate back into place and secure it with a length of rope. They stumbled back toward the cabin, soaked to the bone, shivering, and breathing in ragged gasps. Inside, the fire cast a warm, dancing light. They stood close, dripping on the floorboards, the storm still raging outside. "Thank you," Jeremiah said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She just nodded, unable to speak. A new feeling was taking root between them, something stronger than hope, warmer than companionship. It felt like trust. That night, as they shared a simple meal of bread and stew, the cabin didn't feel small anymore. It felt safe. It felt like home. And Julia allowed herself to believe, for the first time, that maybe she hadn't been running from her past. Maybe she had been running toward this. But out on the plains, the storm had washed something clean. On the muddy road leading to the ranch, a set of fresh tracks appeared, left by a horse moving with a purpose Julia would soon come to know all too well. The ranch began to heal under the spring sun, and so did they. Julia's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became more common. Jeremiah's silences grew less heavy, more comfortable. They found a rhythm in the shared work, a quiet joy in the small moments. A shared cup of coffee at sunrise, the sight of a newborn calf taking its first wobbly steps. The loneliness that had defined both their lives was slowly, steadily receding. One morning, Jeremiah came back from a ride along the property line, a small, clumsy bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He held them out to her, a faint flush on his weathered cheeks. "Found these by the creek," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Tears pricked Julia's eyes. She had thought this land was too harsh for anything so delicate. "I never thought I'd see flowers here," she said softly. He risked a glance at her, a shy smile touching his lips. "Sometimes the land surprises you." She looked out over the rolling hills, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Maybe this man, this land, could do more than just hide her. Maybe they could heal her. Maybe, after everything, love could actually grow here. But the past has a long shadow, and it was stretching all the way from the east. It was a cool afternoon, the kind where the air feels clean and sharp. Julia was humming to herself by the kitchen window, washing dishes, when she saw the rider. He was still a long way off, a dark speck moving steadily up the road. But there was something about him that made the simple tune die in her throat. His horse was too fine for this part of the country, a sleek black animal that moved with an arrogant grace. The rider himself sat tall and straight in the saddle, his clothes dark and well-tailored. He didn't look like a rancher or a drifter. He looked like a wolf in sheep's country. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Jeremiah saw him too. He was mending a harness on the porch, and he went still, his hands freezing over his work. He slowly stood up, his face becoming a hard, unreadable mask. He moved to stand by the gate, his posture casual, but his body coiled like a spring. The stranger rode right up to the fence, stopping his horse just a few feet away. He swept off his hat, revealing a handsome, cruel face, and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "Miss Julia?" he asked. His voice was smooth as silk, but it slid over her skin like something foul. Julia's hands were frozen to the dishcloth. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. "I'm Thomas," the man said, his gaze fixed on her through the open cabin door. A friend of the family, from back east. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. What business do you have here? His voice was dangerously quiet. Thomas gave a thin, humorless smile. Just checking on an old acquaintance, making sure she's settled. The way he said the word made it sound like an accusation, a threat. It was a lie. Julia knew exactly who he was, and he was no friend. He was the reason she had run. He was the man who had turned her life into a nightmare. He was the very thing she had crossed a continent to escape. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Jeremiah, her eyes wide with a silent plea. What could she do? What could she say? Julia, Jeremiah said, his voice soft but firm, never taking his eyes off Thomas. You don't have to speak to him. But she knew she couldn't hide behind Jeremiah. Not forever. This was her ghost, her demon. She had to face him. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped out onto the porch. I'll talk to him, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Thomas dismounted, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked toward her, his cold eyes never leaving her face. I told you there was nowhere you could run, he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Did you really think this backwoods farmer could protect you from me? I'm not the same person you knew, she said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He let out a short, cold laugh. Oh, I think you are. You're still the same frightened little bird, and you have something that belongs to me. Jeremiah took a step forward, placing himself between them. That's enough. State your business and leave. You're not welcome on my land. The air crackled with tension. Thomas looked from Jeremiah's hard face to Julia's pale one. For a moment, it seemed like violence would erupt right there in the dusty yard. Then, Thomas's cruel smile returned. He slowly backed away, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Very well. Have it your way. For now. He swung himself back onto his horse with practiced ease. This isn't over, Julia, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. I always get what I want. He turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Julia started to tremble, the strength that had held her up draining away like water through sand. Jeremiah turned and caught her as her knees buckled. You're safe here, he said, his voice a fierce promise. But as he held her, he glanced down at the road where Thomas had disappeared. And in his eyes was not just anger, but a flicker of something else. Recognition. As if he hadn't just seen a man from Julia's past, but a ghost from his own. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to offer little warmth against the chill that had settled over the cabin. The shadows it cast on the walls twisted and danced like the fears in Julia's mind. Thomas was here. He had found her. The fragile peace she had started to build was shattered. She stared into the flames, reliving every threat, every cold smile, her life before Montana playing out like a horror story in her head. Jeremiah sat across from her, his usual silence now filled with a heavy, unspoken question. He watched her, his brow furrowed with concern. Finally, he broke the silence. You don't have to carry it alone, he said, his voice a low rumble. Julia looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. You don't understand, she whispered. He's not just a man I used to know. He's a monster. Jeremiah leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I've been hurt too, he said, his gaze unwavering. Love isn't easy, but it's worth fighting for. Whatever this is, whoever he is, we'll fight him. Together. It was the we that broke her. For the first time, Julia let herself truly cry. Not just tears of fear or frustration, but a deep soul-wrenching sob that carried years of pain and loneliness with it. She told him everything. About Thomas, about the powerful family he worked for, about the secret she had stumbled upon, a secret they would kill to protect. She told him how she had been forced to flee, changing her name, using the mail-order bride system as a desperate longshot to disappear into the vastness of the American frontier. Jeremiah listened without interruption, his expression growing harder with every word. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, he simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the last of her sobs subsided. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy solutions. He just held her, a solid, unshakable presence in the terrifying darkness. The next few days were quiet, but it was the quiet of a coiled snake. The threat of Thomas lingered over the ranch like a poison cloud. Julia found herself jumping at every sound, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. But she wasn't alone in her fear anymore. She was learning to trust Jeremiah, not just with her safety, but with her secrets. And in return, he began to share his own. One evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple, Jeremiah finally told her his story. He spoke of the woman he had loved, a fiery, intelligent woman named Eleanor. He told Julia how they had planned a life together, right here on this ranch. But Eleanor had been ambitious. She'd gotten involved with some wealthy investors from the East, men who promised to help expand the ranch, to bring the railroad through their valley. His voice grew soft, filled with a pain so old it had become a part of him. She went to the city to finalize the deal, he said, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory. She never came back. They told me it was an accident, a carriage crash. He paused, his throat working. I never believed them. She wrote to me a week before. She said she'd discovered something terrible about the men she was in business with, that the deal was a sham. She was scared. He finally looked at Julia, his eyes dark with a dawning, horrifying realization. The name of the company she was working with. It was the same name you just told me, the family Thomas works for. The air in the room went cold. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The two dark threads of their pasts, stretching from opposite ends of the country, had just twisted together into a single deadly knot. The danger Julia had brought to his doorstep was a danger that had been waiting for him here all along. The ghost he had been mourning was the same ghost she was running from. And Thomas hadn't just come back for Julia. He had come back to bury a secret that was nearly 2 decades old. The revelation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. It was no longer Julia's past or Jeremiah's past. It was their present, a shared and immediate danger. The rustlers that had been plaguing the territory, the whispers of trouble in the nearby town. It all started to click into a terrifying new picture. This wasn't random frontier violence. It was a coordinated effort. Thomas wasn't just one man, he had a crew, and they weren't just here to intimidate Julia. They were here to take the ranch. The railroad, Jeremiah said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. That's what they wanted then, and that's what they want now. Your secret, whatever it is, must be tied to this land, to the path the railroad needs to take. He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his movements agitated, like a caged wolf. They killed Eleanor to shut her up, and now they've sent Thomas to get rid of you and take this ranch by force, making it look like the work of common outlaws. Julia's blood ran cold. The satchel, she whispered, her eyes wide with understanding. The papers I took, they're ledgers, proof that they've been cheating, stealing land from ranchers all along the proposed route, illegally. They detail the whole scheme. Suddenly, the world outside the cabin seemed to shrink, the vast Montana wilderness becoming a hunting ground where they were the prey. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. We can't stay here, Julia said, her voice trembling. We have to run. No, Jeremiah said, stopping his pacing. He turned to face her, and in his eyes, the grief that had haunted him for years was being burned away by a cold, hard fire. It was the fire of long-delayed vengeance. "I ran once," he said, his voice low and guttural. "I hid from the world after they took her from me. I'm not running again. This is my land. This was her land. We're not giving them one more inch." A new strength bloomed in Julia's chest, fed by his resolve. He was right. She had been running for too long. Here, with this man, she had found something worth fighting for. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now. "What do we do?" The planning began that night. The ranch, once a place of quiet labor, became a fortress. They worked under the cover of darkness, their movements swift and silent. Jeremiah's knowledge of the land was their greatest weapon. He knew every ravine, every rock outcropping, every hidden game trail. He taught Julia how to use a rifle, not just to aim and fire, but to breathe, to be patient, to make every shot count. To her surprise, she was a natural. The city woman's hands, once soft and clumsy, were now steady and sure as she loaded cartridges and cleaned the barrel. They booby-trapped the main path to the cabin with snares and deadfalls. They stashed supplies, water, ammunition, food, in a small, hidden cave in the hills behind the ranch. They were no longer just a rancher and a mail-order bride. They were soldiers preparing for a siege. During the long, tense days, they worked together, a silent understanding passing between them. They were a team, their every move complementing the others. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning determination. One night, as they sat sharpening knives by the low light of a single lantern, Jeremiah reached into an old wooden chest tucked under his bed. He pulled out a worn leather gun belt. The pistol in the holster was heavy, ornate, with a pearl handle. "This was my father's," he said, handing it to her. "He taught me to shoot before he taught me to read." He then pulled out another one, a simpler, more rugged Colt. And this was hers. He strapped Eleanor's gun belt around his own waist. It was a declaration. The ghosts of the past were no longer haunting them. They were arming them. The attack came a few nights later, under the sliver of a new moon. It wasn't a direct assault. It was cunning. They started with the cattle. A few distant panicked bellows were the first warning. The rustlers, Thomas's men, were trying to draw Jeremiah out, to separate them. "Stay here," Jeremiah ordered, grabbing his rifle. "No," Julia said, picking up her own. "You said we do this together." He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not a frightened woman, but a warrior. He gave a single, sharp nod. They moved out into the darkness, side by side. They didn't go for the cattle. They knew it was a trap. Instead, they circled around, using the terrain for cover, moving toward a rocky overlook that gave them a clear view of the pens. They saw them then. 4 men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, pushing the herd toward a break in the fence. A 5th man sat on his horse a short distance away, directing them. Thomas. "They're trying to lure us into the open field," Jeremiah whispered, his voice barely a breath of sound. "We wait." The men grew impatient. One of them lit a torch, casting flickering, monstrous shadows across the yard. He rode toward the cabin. "Come on out, rancher!" he yelled. "We just want the beef. Don't have to be any trouble." That was their mistake. The torch made him a perfect target. "Take the one with the light," Jeremiah whispered. Julia rested her rifle on a rock, took a steadying breath, lined up the sights and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the valley. The torch fell to the ground, sputtering in the dirt. The man clutched his shoulder, screaming in pain and surprise as his horse reared and bolted. All hell broke loose. The other men, startled and confused, started firing wildly into the darkness. But they were shooting at shadows. From their perch, Jeremiah and Julia had all the advantages. They fired back, not to kill, but to maim, to confuse, to drive them off. Another man went down, his leg shattered by a well-aimed shot from Jeremiah. The remaining 2 rustlers lost their nerve. They turned and fled into the night, dragging their wounded comrades with them. Thomas, however, did not run. He sat on his horse, staring up at the ridge where the shots had come from. Even in the darkness, Julia could feel the cold fury of his gaze. He raised a pistol and fired a single shot in their direction, a bullet that whizzed past Jeremiah's head, close enough to make him flinch. It wasn't a shot meant to hit. It was a promise. They retreated to the cabin, their hearts pounding, adrenaline singing in their veins. They had won the first battle. But they both knew the war was far from over. Thomas knew where they were. He knew they were armed and ready to fight. And he was not a man who accepted defeat. He wouldn't come back with a small band of thugs. Next time, he would come back with an army. He would come back to burn them to the ground. The victory was short-lived. The silence that followed the failed raid was more menacing than the gunshots had been. They knew Thomas was out there, regrouping, planning his next move. The ranch was no longer a home, it was a prison, and the vast, beautiful landscape had become the walls of their cage. Sleep came in fits and starts, one of them always on watch while the other rested, a rifle never more than an arm's length away. Days crawled by. The tension was a physical thing, a constant tightness in their chests. Jeremiah taught Julia how to track, showing her the subtle signs of a broken twig, a disturbed patch of earth. "He'll send a scout," he explained, his voice low. "He'll want to know our routines, our defenses." They spent hours circling the property, erasing their own tracks, laying false trails that led to dead ends or dangerous ravines. They were turning the land itself into a weapon. During one of these patrols, Julia found it. Tucked under a loose rock near the creek was a small, carved wooden bird. Her blood ran cold. It was a specific carving, a nightingale, something Thomas used to leave for her as a twisted sort of calling card back east. It was a message. He had been close enough to touch their water source, close enough to watch them. The psychological warfare had begun. That night, the fear began to eat at her resolve. "Maybe we should have run," she whispered into the darkness of the cabin. "We can't win, Jeremiah. He has too many men, too much money." Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He was cleaning his rifle, the soft, methodical clicks of the metal the only sound in the room. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear and hard in the lamplight. "He thinks he's hunting us," he said. "He's wrong. We're hunting him." He walked over to a loose floorboard near the hearth, a spot she'd never noticed before. He pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of dynamite. Julia stared at it, her eyes wide. "Where did you get that?" "The railroad was surveying here years ago. Before Eleanor. Before everything. They left some behind in an old mining shack. I kept it. Just in case." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "We're not going to wait for him to come to us. We're going to him." His plan was audacious, bordering on insane. He knew from his tracking that Thomas and his men had made a camp in a narrow box canyon about 5 miles from the ranch. It was defensible, with high walls and a single entrance. A perfect place to weather a siege, but also a perfect trap. Jeremiah planned to use the dynamite to seal the entrance to the canyon, trapping Thomas and his crew inside. "It's a cage," Jeremiah explained, tracing a map in the dirt on the cabin floor. "Once they're in, they can't get out. We cut them off from supplies, from water. We can wait them out." "Or they'll just rush us," Julia countered, her heart pounding at the sheer risk of it. "Not if we time it right," he said. "They've been getting bolder, making supply runs to the town at night. We hit them when half the men are gone. We trigger the rock slide, seal the canyon. Then we deal with the rest." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting to die. The following evening, under the cloak of a moonless, overcast sky, they set out. They moved like ghosts through the familiar landscape, their senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. When they reached the ridge overlooking the canyon, they saw the flicker of a campfire below. Jeremiah counted the figures. 6 men. He had guessed that at least 4 more would be on the supply run. The odds were still not in their favor, but it was the best they were going to get. They planted the dynamite charges along the loose rock face at the narrowest point of the canyon entrance. Jeremiah worked with a grim, focused efficiency, his hands steady as he set the fuses. Julia stood guard, her rifle at the ready, her eyes scanning the darkness. The fate of their lives, their future, came down to this. A few sticks of dynamite, and a prayer. They were about to light the fuse when they heard it, the sound of approaching horses. But they weren't coming from the direction of the town. They were coming from behind them. A patrol. 2 of Thomas's men circling back. They were trapped. The hunters were about to become the hunted. There was no time to think, no time to run. Jeremiah and Julia flattened themselves behind a cluster of boulders as the 2 riders approached, their casual conversation drifting on the still night air. They were going to pass within 10 feet of their position. Discovery was inevitable. In that split second, Jeremiah made a decision. He looked at Julia, put a finger to his lips, and then pointed at the rider on the left. He would take the one on the right. It was a silent, brutal ballet in the darkness. As the riders drew level with the rocks, Jeremiah and Julia rose as one. Jeremiah's arm snaked around his target's neck, pulling him from the saddle before he could utter a sound. Julia was less practiced, but just as desperate. She swung the butt of her rifle with all her might, connecting with the side of the other man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. They stood over the 2 unconscious men, their chests heaving, the metallic taste of fear in their mouths. They had crossed a line. This was no longer just self-defense. This was a war. "Drag them out of sight," Jeremiah whispered, his voice hoarse. "Quickly." They hid the men and their horses in a thicket of pine, then scrambled back to the fuses. There was no more time for subtlety. From the canyon below, a shout went up. The men at the campfire had heard the brief scuffle. "Who's out there?" "Now!" Jeremiah yelled. He lit the fuse. It sputtered to life, a tiny, angry snake of fire eating its way toward the dynamite. They didn't wait to see the result. They turned and ran, plunging into the darkness as the ground behind them erupted in a deafening roar. Rocks and earth rained down from the sky. The entrance to the box canyon was gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble. They had trapped the beast. But they were on the outside with the rest of his pack, who would now be racing back from their supply run, drawn by the sound of the explosion. And they were coming for blood. The thunder of the explosion faded, replaced by the ringing in their ears and the pounding of their own hearts. They had done it. They had sealed the canyon. But the sound of the blast was a dinner bell, and they were the meal. They could already hear the frantic shouts of the returning riders, their voices carrying on the night air. "This way!" Jeremiah grabbed Julia's hand, pulling her away from the ridge and into the labyrinth of ravines and gullies that snaked through the hills. "They'll go for the canyon first. That'll buy us some time, but not much." They ran, their lungs burning, branches whipping at their faces. This was Jeremiah's land, and he moved through it with the certainty of a mountain lion, his feet seeming to know every rock and root even in the pitch dark. Julia followed, her trust in him absolute. He led them not back toward the ranch, that would be the first place the riders would look, but deeper into the wilderness, toward the jagged peaks that loomed in the distance. They finally stopped in a small, sheltered clearing, hidden by a curtain of ancient pine trees. Julia collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. "What now?" she panted. "Now we change the game," Jeremiah said. He was already pulling supplies from the small pack he carried. A length of rope, a few canteens, and a leather-wrapped package. He unwrapped it, revealing Eleanor's journal. "When Thomas and his men realize they're trapped, they'll be desperate," he said, his voice grim. "But the men on the outside, they're the real problem. They'll tear the county apart looking for us. We need to give them something else to look for." He flipped through the journal, his finger tracing Eleanor's elegant script. "She wrote everything down," he murmured. "Names, dates, the illegal land grabs. She even suspected who was behind it all, a powerful railroad baron named Alastair Finch. He's the one who signs Thomas's checks. The proof is in here. But a book is just a book unless the right people read it." "The sheriff?" Julia suggested. Jeremiah shook his head. "Sheriff Miller is a good man, but he's outmanned and outgunned. Finch's money probably has half the territory's officials in his pocket. We take this to Miller, we might as well hand it to Thomas directly. No. We need to go over his head, the U.S. Marshals." The nearest marshal's office was in Helena, over 100 miles away, a journey that would be difficult under normal circumstances, and nearly impossible while being hunted. "We can't both go," Julia said, the realization dawning on her. "They're looking for two people, a man and a woman. If we split up—" "One of us might make it," Jeremiah finished for her. He looked at her, his face a mixture of fear and resolve. "You should go. You're faster, you can ride lighter. Take my best horse, follow the creek north. It'll hide your tracks. I'll stay here. I'll lead them on a chase, draw them away from you. Give you a head start." "No," Julia said, her voice fierce. "Absolutely not. I'm not leaving you." "Julia, this is our only chance," he argued. "Then we take it together," she shot back. "Or we die together. I'm not running anymore, remember? And I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Oh, the argument in her eyes was one he couldn't win. He saw the same stubborn fire that had been in Eleanor, the same unwillingness to back down. He gave a slow nod. "All right. Together." Their new plan was even riskier. They would travel together, but they would use misdirection. They spent the next hour setting a false trail, one that led east, toward the plains. They used the horses they had captured from the patrol, making it look like two people had fled in a panic. Then, they doubled back on foot, painstakingly covering their tracks, and set off on a grueling journey north toward the mountains, toward Helena. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. They moved at night, hiding during the day in caves and thickets, rationing their meager supplies. They ate wild berries and jerky, their water tasting of mud and metal from their canteens. The constant threat of discovery wore on their nerves. Every snap of a twig could be one of Thomas's men. Every shadow could be a threat. But something strange was happening between them. Stripped of everything but the need to survive, they became something more than allies. They moved as one entity. He would spot a trail, and she would know which way to turn without a word. She would hear a sound, and he would already have his rifle raised. They communicated in glances, in gestures, in a shared silence that was deeper and more intimate than any words. One cold night, huddled together for warmth in a shallow cave, Jeremiah took her hand. "When this is over," he said, his voice a low whisper against the wind. "If we get out of this, He trailed off, unable to find the words. Julia squeezed his hand. "I know," she whispered back. "Me too." They were getting close. They could see the distant lights of a mining settlement, a sign that civilization in Helena was not far off. Their hope, for the first time, began to feel real. That was when their luck ran out. As they were crossing a moonlit clearing, a voice cut through the darkness. "Going somewhere?" They froze. Stepping out from the trees were 3 of Thomas's men, and behind them, a 4th figure. It wasn't Thomas, it was Sheriff Miller. A gun was in his hand, and it was pointed directly at them. "I'm sorry, folks," the sheriff said, his face etched with regret. Mr. Finch pays a lot better than the county does. The trap hadn't just been in the canyon. The entire territory was the trap. The betrayal hit them harder than a physical blow. Sheriff Miller, the man they had thought was their last hope if things went wrong, was on Finch's payroll. The law in this part of Montana was just another weapon for the highest bidder. "Give me the book, Julia," Miller said, his voice tired. "And the satchel. Thomas wants them intact. Do that, and I'll make this quick. My orders are to leave no witnesses." Jeremiah slowly raised his hands, subtly moving to place himself in front of Julia. "You don't have to do this, Miller," he said, his voice calm and even. "You're a lawman." "I'm a man with a family to feed," Miller retorted, his gun unwavering. "Now, the satchel." One of the other men, a hulking brute with a scarred face, stepped forward, a greedy leer on his face. "Let's just take it from 'em, Sheriff, and have some fun with the girl first." A cold rage, pure and absolute, washed over Jeremiah. He had spent 20 years letting grief and loneliness tame the fire inside him. Now that fire roared back to life. But before he could move, Julia did something unexpected. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You want it? Here." She held out the satchel. The scarred man laughed and reached for it. As his fingers brushed the leather, Julia yanked it back and swung it with all her force, not at him, but at the ground by his feet. There was a dull metallic thud as something heavy inside hit a rock. A small, almost invisible cloud of dust puffed out from the satchel's seams. It was flour, or dust. Something innocuous. But the men all flinched back. "What was that?" Miller demanded, his eyes narrowed. "A little insurance," Julia said, a strange, fierce smile on her face. "Those aren't just ledgers in there. It's evidence from a federal investigation, and that satchel is lined with anthrax spores. You open it, you breathe it in, you'll be dead in a week. A very painful week." The men stared at her, their bravado evaporating, replaced by a primal fear. They had heard whispers of such things, biological weapons used in the war. The idea was terrifying, alien. "She's bluffing," the scarred man growled, but he didn't move any closer. "Am I?" Julia's smile was icy. "The man I stole this from was a government chemist before he worked for Finch. He liked to experiment. Are you willing to bet your life on a bluff?" Jeremiah seized the moment of hesitation. While all eyes were on Julia and her terrifying satchel, he moved. He lunged not at Miller, but at the man to his left, driving his shoulder into the man's gut and grabbing for his pistol. The clearing erupted into chaos. A gunshot rang out, wild and loud. Julia threw the satchel at the scarred man's face and dove for cover behind a fallen log. The firefight was brutal and short. Jeremiah, fueled by righteous fury, was a force of nature. He used the captured pistol to take down one man, then wrestled the rifle from another. Sheriff Miller, a man who preferred threats to actual violence, hesitated for a fatal second. It was all Jeremiah needed. He fired, not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet tore through Miller's wrist, sending his gun flying into the undergrowth. The sheriff screamed and collapsed, clutching his shattered hand. The last man standing was the scarred brute. He saw the tide had turned and made a run for it, disappearing into the dark woods. Jeremiah stood panting in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the wounded and groaning men. Julia slowly emerged from behind the log, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the satchel, now lying discarded on the ground. "Anthrax?" Jeremiah asked, raising an eyebrow. Julia gave a shaky laugh. "It was baking soda. I packed some to make biscuits." A slow grin spread across Jeremiah's face, a look of pure admiration and relief. He crossed the clearing and pulled her into a fierce hug, lifting her off her feet. "You are full of surprises," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Their relief was cut short by a groan from Sheriff Miller. "You're dead," he rasped, cradling his bloody wrist. "You're both dead. Thomas is out. He got out of the canyon, and he's coming." A cold dread washed over them. They had won the battle, but the monster was free, and now he knew exactly where they were. They grabbed what ammunition they could from the fallen men, took Miller's horse, and fled into the night. The lights of the mining town were closer now, a beacon of hope. But they knew Thomas would be between them and safety. The final confrontation was coming. They rode hard, pushing the horse to its limit, the sheriff's warning echoing in their minds. Thomas was out. The name was a curse, a promise of violence that dogged their heels. They didn't need to look back to know he was coming. They could feel it, a cold pressure on the backs of their necks. The mining town of Polaris was a jumble of rough-hewn buildings clinging to the side of a mountain, its lights a smear of yellow in the pre-dawn gloom. It represented safety, law, a chance to get their story to someone who couldn't be bought. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking the town, they saw him. A lone rider, sitting motionless on a black horse on the main road into town. Thomas. He was waiting for them. He had anticipated their every move. "He's cut us off," Julia whispered, her voice tight with despair. "No," Jeremiah said, his eyes scanning the terrain. "He's given us the battlefield." He pointed to the skeletal remains of the old mining operation that dotted the hillside above the town, a maze of rickety trestles, abandoned mine shafts, and slag heaps. "He's expecting us to come down the road. We're not going to." They dismounted, leaving the horse tied in a grove of trees. "This ends tonight, Julia," Jeremiah said, turning to her. He took Eleanor's journal from his pack and handed it to her. "You are going to get into that town. You're going to find the telegraph office. You're going to wire the U.S. Marshal in Helena. You're going to tell them everything." "What about you?" she asked, her heart seizing with fear. "I'm going to give Thomas what he wants," he said, his face set like stone. "A fight. I'll draw his attention. Keep him busy while you get through. Go. Now." Before she could protest, he kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss filled with everything they hadn't had time to say. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows of the abandoned mine works. Julia clutched the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She had to believe in him. She had to believe in them. She turned and began a perilous, scrambling descent down the far side of the hill, toward the back of the town. Jeremiah moved through the ruins of the mine like a phantom. This was his element. Broken machinery, treacherous footing, deep shadows. He climbed onto the roof of the old processing mill, a hulking, dilapidated structure that overlooked the road. He chambered around in his rifle and waited. Thomas was patient. He sat on his horse, a silhouette of vengeance against the rising sun. He knew they were there. He was letting them feel the pressure, letting the fear cook. Finally, he dismounted and began to walk slowly toward the mine, his movements calm and deliberate. "Jeremiah!" His voice echoed in the morning stillness. "I know you're in here. I have a proposition for you. Give me the woman and the ledgers and I'll let you live. You can keep this worthless scrap of land. A fair trade, isn't it? A woman for a pile of dirt." Jeremiah didn't answer. He just watched, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I know all about you," Thomas continued, his voice taking on a conversational, chilling tone. "The lonely rancher, pining for his dead love, Eleanor. Did you know I met her? A fiery woman, a little too smart for her own good. She's the one who found the ledgers in the first place, you know. Finch offered her a fortune to keep quiet. She refused, a foolish, principled woman, just like this one." Every word was a poisoned dart, calculated to break Jeremiah's focus. But it had the opposite effect. It solidified his rage into a diamond-hard point of certainty. This man would not leave this mountain alive. "She fought," Thomas said with a cold chuckle. "Right up to the end." That was the last word he would say. Jeremiah fired. The shot wasn't aimed at Thomas, but at a rusty bell hanging from the mill's gable, right above his head. The bullet clanged against the metal, the sound deafening in the quiet air. Thomas dove for cover behind a pile of mine tailings as Jeremiah fired again and again, kicking up dust and rock chips, pinning him down. The battle had begun. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the decaying mine. Thomas was skilled, a professional killer. But Jeremiah had the land on his side. He knew the shadows, the weak spots in the rotting floorboards, the echoes that could trick the ear. He led Thomas on a chase, deeper and deeper into the labyrinthine structures. Meanwhile, Julia had made it to the edge of town. She crept along the backs of buildings, her heart in her throat. The sound of gunshots from the hill above spurred her on. She found the telegraph office. The door was locked. With a surge of desperate strength, she shattered a window with a rock, climbed inside, and frantically began searching for the telegraph key. Back at the mine, the fight had become personal. Thomas managed to outmaneuver Jeremiah, cornering him in the dark, cavernous space of the stamping mill. Giant, dormant machines stood like iron sentinels in the gloom. "It's over, old man," Thomas hissed from the shadows. "You fought well, but you're just a farmer." "I'm more than that." Jeremiah's voice came from an unexpected direction. He had climbed into the rafters above. "I'm the man whose life you ruined." He dropped down behind Thomas, and the fight became a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. They crashed against the iron machinery, their grunts and the thud of their blows echoing in the vast space. Thomas was younger, faster. He landed a vicious blow that sent Jeremiah staggering back. Thomas drew a knife, its blade gleaming in a stray shaft of light. "Just like Eleanor!" he sneered, lunging. But Jeremiah was ready. He sidestepped the lunge and grabbed a heavy iron wrench from a nearby workbench. He swung it in a desperate, powerful arc. The wrench connected with Thomas's arm with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas screamed in pain and rage, cradling his broken arm. Jeremiah stood over him, breathing heavily, the wrench held ready. Justice, he had learned, wasn't something you were given. It was something you took. Down in the town, Julia finally sent her message, her fingers flying over the key, tapping out the story of murder, corruption, and greed. As she finished, the door of the office burst open. She spun around, her heart stopping. But it wasn't one of Thomas's men. It was a group of grizzled miners, their faces grim, holding pickaxes and shotguns. "We heard the shootin'," one of them said, "and we heard your message clacking out. We've had enough of Finch and his thugs in this town." As the sun climbed fully into the sky, a posse of armed miners, led by Julia, marched up the hill toward the old mill. They found Jeremiah standing over a defeated and broken Thomas. A short time later, 2 U.S. Marshals, summoned by Julia's frantic telegraph, rode into town with federal warrants for Alistair Finch and his entire criminal enterprise. The seasons turned. Spring blossomed into a warm, gentle summer across the Montana plains. The wind still whispered through the tall grass, but it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a promise. The ranch, once a place of loneliness and ghosts, was now a home, filled with the warmth of a shared life and the quiet hum of a hard-won peace. Jeremiah and Julia stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. The darkness of their pasts had been brought into the light, and in its place, something new and beautiful had grown. They had faced down monsters, fought a war, and found in each other a strength neither knew they possessed. They were no longer two broken souls brought together by chance. They were partners, forged in fire, their love a testament to their survival. Jeremiah reached out and took Julia's hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I never thought I'd find a love like this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You brought life back to this ranch. You brought life back to me." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, a soft smile on her lips. We did it together. The land around them was vast and wild, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibilities, of a future they would build with their own two hands. A future of love, of healing, and of new beginnings. Their story was a reminder that sometimes the deepest scars can heal, and that even in the most desolate of places, hope can take root and bloom. Thank you for joining Jeremiah and Julia on their incredible journey. If you were moved by their story of courage and love, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. Until next time, may you find the strength to face your own wilderness and the courage to fight for your own home.